This is BBC One in the South. Now at 1 o'clock, the BBC News with Sophie Raworth.
A huge moment in history as the UK votes to leave the European Union. The Prime Minister, David Cameron, says he will now stand down. After more than 4 decades in the EU, a decisive vote as more than 17 million people vote to leave. There was jubilation in the Leave camp. UKIP's Nigel Farage called it a victory for ordinary people against the big banks, big business and big politics. Within hours, David Cameron announced he would resign as Prime Minister, saying that fresh leadership was now needed.
I will do everything I can as Prime Minister to steady the ship over the coming weeks and months. But I do not think it would be right for me to try to be the captain that steers our country to its next destination.
Boris Johnson says the UK can be proud of the result and called for a swift exit and calm heads.
Nothing will change over the short term, except that work will have to begin on how to give effect to the will of the people and to extricate this country from the supranational system.
Scotland voted overwhelmingly to remain in the EU. First Minister Nicola Sturgeon says it puts a second referendum on Scottish independence back on the table.
It is a significant and material change in circumstances, and it is therefore a statement of the obvious that the option of a second referendum must be on the table.
Dramatic falls for both the pound and for the markets following the news, but the Bank of England says it's taking all necessary steps to keep the economy stable.
In the South, celebrations for the Leave campaign, as people in the South vote decisively to exit the European Union. And as David Cameron steps down as Prime Minister, we get reaction from his Oxfordshire constituency.
Good afternoon and welcome to the BBC News at 1 from Downing Street on a momentous day. After more than 40 years, Britain has voted to end its membership of the European Union. The vote was decisive. 52% chose to leave the EU, 48% wanted to stay. Within hours, David Cameron announced he was standing down as Prime Minister. He said he'd stay in number 10 for the next few months, but that the country required fresh leadership. Boris Johnson, who campaigned for a Leave vote, said the UK now had a glorious opportunity to pass its own laws, set its own taxes and find its voice in the world again. We'll have all the reaction from Westminster, from the city and from the rest of Europe. But first, our political correspondent Carol Walker reports on an historic night.
The people have voted for a new destiny for Britain.
This means that the UK has voted to leave the European Union.
It is a decision few predicted at the start of this campaign, a decision which has forced the Prime Minister out of office. There was no hiding the emotion as David Cameron with his wife Samantha emerged in Downing Street.
The British people have voted to leave the European Union, and their will must be respected.
He had fought and lost the battle to persuade the country to stay in the European Union.
I fought this campaign in the only way I know how, which is to say directly and passionately what I think and feel, head, heart and soul. I held nothing back, but the British people have made a very clear decision to take a different path. And as such, I think the country requires fresh leadership to take it in this direction. I will do everything I can as Prime Minister to steady the ship over the coming weeks and months. But I do not think it would be right for me to try to be the captain that steers our country to its next destination.
From the moment the results started coming in just after midnight, there were big wins for Leave.
The total number of votes cast in favour of Leave was 82,000.
By the end of the night, Leave had won a clean sweep across the north of England, the Midlands, the east and west of England. London was the only region of England to support remaining a member of the EU. The result in Flintshire reflected the outcome across Wales. Voters backed Brexit. But Northern Ireland voted to remain in the EU. Sinn Féin said it intensifies the case for a vote on whether Northern Ireland should leave the United Kingdom. And Scotland, as expected, voted by a clear majority to stay in the EU. Scotland's First Minister said it was democratically unacceptable for it to be taken out of the EU against its will.
Scotland does now face that prospect. It is a significant and material change in circumstances, and it is therefore a statement of the obvious that the option of a second referendum must be on the table, and it is on the table.
But at Westminster, jubilant Leave campaigners have been celebrating. Nigel Farage said he was thrilled that the country had decided to break free from what he called a failing, dying European Union.
17 million people have said we must leave the European Union. We now need a Brexit government. A government that gets on with the job. A government that begins the renegotiation of our trade relationship.
Boris Johnson struggled through the throng at his home, then paid tribute to the Prime Minister for his bravery in giving the British people their say.
I believe we now have a glorious opportunity. We can pass our laws and set our taxes entirely according to the needs of the UK economy. We can control our own borders in a way that is not discriminatory, but fair and balanced, and take the wind out of the sails of the extremists and those who would play politics with immigration.
But in the city, shares plunged and the pound fell dramatically, despite all the attempts at reassurance from political leaders and the Bank of England, which promised to take whatever measures were necessary to support the economy. And there are now questions over the future of the Labour leader, who's been blamed for a lacklustre campaign to remain in the EU, which failed to convince many Labour supporters.
Clearly, there are some very difficult days ahead. The value of the pound has already fallen, and there will therefore be job consequences as a result of this decision.
The Prime Minister's resigned. Can you give us a reaction?
No reaction, but two senior Labour MPs have tabled a motion of no confidence in Mr Corbyn's leadership.
I think Jeremy Corbyn should resign as leader of the Labour Party. This was a test of leadership, the European referendum campaign. He started too late. He was very half-hearted in the leadership he gave to Labour under it.
A momentous day.
Thank you very much.
For Britain, for Europe, as the country embarks on a new and uncertain future, outside the EU and under a different leader. Carol Walker, BBC News, Westminster.
Our assistant political editor Norman Smith joins me here in Downing Street. A seismic moment in our history. We are leaving the EU, the Prime Minister is standing down, and now questions too about the Labour leader.
Sophie, the scale, the pace, the drama of the change this morning. I mean, I almost feel physically buffeted by the change sweeping through Westminster, sweeping through the country, maybe even sweeping through Europe. It's as if all the pieces of the political and constitutional jigsaw have just been thrown up in the air, and we don't quite know how they're going to land. So here we have a Prime Minister who just 12 months ago grabbed his party by the scruff of its neck, dragged it to a surprise election victory and seemed master of all he surveyed. Now he is gone. Instead, his nemesis, Boris Johnson, a man who many Tories reviled during this campaign as unfit to lead this party, is poised potentially as the next Prime Minister. The Union, which 2 years ago seemed safeguarded for a generation, is once more in doubt. Nicola Sturgeon saying it's democratically unacceptable for Scots to be taken out against their will, and Jeremy Corbyn facing his own leadership challenge. And on top of all that, we have this massive, massive moment of change when we turn away from 40 years of our settled history with being part of what was then the common market and the European Union. And I think no wonder really that Boris Johnson and Michael Gove today sought to reassure people, because this has been in many ways a sort of very British revolution. No one has been hurt, no blood has been spilled, but it has been a moment of profound change.
Norman Smith, thank you. Well, as the result became clear, the pound plunged. It was the biggest drop on record, and at one point it fell to levels not seen since 1985. The Governor of the Bank of England, Mark Carney, has sought to reassure financial markets and said the bank was well prepared. Our economics correspondent Andy Verity reports.
Panic on the markets on a scale not seen since the global financial crisis. The fear that this could turn into another one drove the pound down 12% this morning, the biggest drop in half a century. And when it opened at 8 a.m, the stock market crashed. The same man who warned Brexit could trigger a recession was now seeking to prevent one through reassurance, announcing he'd lend up to £250 billion more to banks who need funds.
We are well prepared for this. Her Majesty's Treasury and the Bank of England have engaged in extensive contingency planning, and the Chancellor and I have remained in close contact, including through the night and this morning. To be clear, the Bank of England will not hesitate to take additional measures as required, as markets adjust, and as the UK economy moves forward.
Mark Carney's intervention helped to stem the panic, and both the pound and the share market recovered nearly half their losses.
He deviated from his doomsday message from just a couple of weeks ago to try and reassure the markets and to also really say that he'll do whatever it takes to prop up the UK economy during this difficult transition. The markets love it when a central bank says, we will do whatever it takes.
But in Europe, shares were hit even harder. Business people who count on the single market are worried.
The business community is really disturbed and disappointed by this. The ramifications are very clear. We're going to have a period of great volatility and instability and uncertainty. And we see already in the markets things that we were most concerned about, a drop in the value of sterling in the stock markets, not just in the UK, around the world.
The immediate effect is on this, the value of the pound. If you're a tourist coming to this Bureau de Change in London, you'll get more pounds for your euros or your dollars. On the other hand, you, going on holiday, will get fewer euros or dollars for your pound. Exporters may be more competitive because people abroad can buy more of their goods for the same money, but imported prices, goods coming into the country, they'll get more expensive. Most economists warned Brexit would mean a weaker pound, higher prices and slower growth. But no one's saying I told you so. They're praying their forecasts were wrong. Andy Verity, BBC News.
Well, Steph McGovern is at the Bank of England for us this afternoon. Huge falls this morning. Are the markets rallying, the pound rallying?
It's starting to look, Sophie, as if Mark Carney's speech, which he delivered here at the Bank of England this morning, a very calm and measured one, is helping a bit. Looking at the FTSE now, our leading share index of our top 100 companies, that's down just over 4%, so not near the crash we heard Andy Verity talking about this morning when the markets first opened. Equally, the pound has stabilised a bit now, and Mark Carney was really keen to stress that they're well prepared for this and they will do whatever it takes to make sure that financial control is kept stable. Also, he talked a lot as well about the financial crisis we had in the past and how things are very different now, how we have a lot more money in the banks. They have the reserves, that's a lot higher, and also they've been through stress tests for situations like this to make sure that they can cope. Given all of that, though, the markets are still down at the moment, but the governor expected this. He said, we're expecting volatility and we will do whatever it takes to make sure things are kept under control.
Steph McGovern at the Bank of England, thank you. Well, voters in Scotland opted overwhelmingly to stay in the European Union. The First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, says it is democratically unacceptable that Scotland would be taken out of the EU against its will and that a second independence vote is now on the table. Gavin Esler is in Edinburgh for us now. Gavin.
Well, there is a real sense of amazement here in Scotland that a Prime Minister who called a referendum to keep the United Kingdom within the EU may now lead to another referendum which will take Scotland out of the United Kingdom. As Nicola Sturgeon said this morning, a new referendum is highly likely, and she claimed that many no voters from the last referendum in 2014 have told her they intend to switch to yes this time. Glenn Campbell outlines some of the things ahead.
By the time the sun rose over Glasgow, it was clear Scotland had voted very differently from the UK as a whole. firmly endorsing Remain. But those who won Scotland are not celebrating because they've finished on the losing side. Nicola Sturgeon has said it would be a democratic outrage for Scotland to be taken out of the EU against its wishes. Her election manifesto last month said that could trigger another referendum on Scottish independence. In Edinburgh this morning, she said IndyRef 2 was now highly likely because of Brexit.
It is a significant and material change in circumstances, and it is therefore a statement of the obvious that the option of a second referendum must be on the table, and it is on the table.
But her political opponents urge caution.
2 million people in Scotland said they wanted to remain part of the United Kingdom. It looks like we like unions in Scotland. We like the idea of working together, and that's got to be respected.
And we do not address the challenges of leaving the European Union by leaving our own union of nations, our biggest market and our closest friends.
It's less than 2 years since Scotland was last asked about leaving the United Kingdom. Then independence was rejected, 55% to 45%. Clearly, Nicola Sturgeon is prepared to revisit that question, but she's always said she would only do so if she was convinced the yes side would win.
So is there a public appetite to reconsider independence?
Scotland has clearly voted based on the result that they want to remain as part of Europe, so I don't think there's any option but to go for a second referendum.
I think people should get time to calm down and think about it properly. So, not straight away, but definitely in the near future.
We've had enough of referendums and votes.
The EU referendum may have answered one question, but it has opened so many others. Glenn Campbell, BBC News, Edinburgh.
Well, Nigel Farage once described today as Independence Day. Independence for Scotland was perhaps not what he had in mind, but it's certainly on the minds of many Scottish National Party activists. And David Cameron's legacy could not only be leading to Britain leaving the European Union, but leading to the end of the United Kingdom.
Gavin Esler in Edinburgh, thank you. Well, there was great shock across the rest of the European Union as the result became clear this morning. European leaders have called the decision to leave a blow to European unity, but they vowed that they will not allow Britain leaving the EU to break up the Union. The leaders of Germany, France and Italy are to meet next week to discuss the way ahead. Ben Brown reports.
A new day breaks over the British coast, and with it, an entirely new relationship with Europe. Across the Channel, wall-to-wall coverage of last night's dramatic results, and calls in some countries for referendums of their own. The German Chancellor has expressed what she called great regret at the vote.
Was die Folgen dieses Einschnitts in den nächsten Tagen, Wochen, Monaten.
The consequences of this in the days, weeks, months and years ahead will depend on the remaining member states. We shouldn't draw any hasty conclusions which will further divide Europe. We must stay calm and composed.
In Paris, President Hollande said the result is a grave test for Europe.
Ne peut plus faire comme avant.
Europe cannot be like it was before. The people are waiting for the European Union to reaffirm its values: freedom, tolerance and peace.
And on the streets of Europe, ordinary citizens reacted to the news from Britain with shock.
It's a catastrophe,
says a German farmer. I thought we were Europeans, one people. And a Frenchman says he respects the decision, but thinks Britain will suffer. There's been turmoil on the world's financial markets, with huge falls across Europe and Asia. And around the world, leaders are still trying to absorb the enormity of what's happened.
We've seen already large falls on stock markets, and there will be a degree of uncertainty for some time.
But one world figure celebrating today is Donald Trump. Visiting his golf resort in Scotland, he praised the verdict of the British people.
Well, you know, I said this was going to happen, and I think that it's a great thing, and we will see, but I think it's going to be a great thing.
Any words for David Cameron?
Basically, they took back their country. That's a great thing.
Any words for David Cameron?
But some EU leaders are phlegmatic this morning. The Czech Prime Minister says Brexit is not the end of the world, and absolutely not the end of the European Union. Ben Brown, BBC News.
Well, the French President François Hollande said this morning it cannot be business as usual for the rest of the European Union. Now our Europe correspondent Damien Grammaticus is in Brussels, and this is going to have huge reverberations.
It is already, Sophie, having huge reverberations. There is a definite sense of shock here. There is quite some anger, some of it directed towards David Cameron, has been expressed by some for what they view as the risk that he took by calling this referendum. And early this morning when I was meeting a senior EU official, he was palpably shaking. That was just after the result had come out. Now, Angela Merkel has said that this will be a watershed moment for Europe and for the process of European unity. The French president, as you said, François Hollande, has also said that it is a critical moment. I think what we will see, though, very quickly are the practical consequences of this, because we've already seen European leaders moving, and when David Cameron comes here next week, he will find at the summit here next week the 27 who are left meeting together to decide their approach to talks with him. So 27 versus 1, representing 440 million, and they will be representing their own interests in those negotiations.
Damien Grammaticus in Brussels, thank you. So what does happen next? How does the UK leave the European Union? Caroline Hawley has been finding out.
A simple mark on a ballot paper and a political earthquake as Britain votes to leave. So what exactly happens now? Well, Britain remains in the EU until it formally withdraws. The mechanism for that is Article 50 of the Lisbon Treaty. It's never been used before. But it gives a country 2 years to negotiate on the terms of the divorce after it notifies the EU of its intention to split. David Cameron says it'll be for Britain's next Prime Minister to push the button. One of the first priorities will be to negotiate new trade deals. The EU is Britain's biggest trading partner. With its 500 million people, it's one of the world's largest economies. But Britain will also need to negotiate new agreements with other parts of the world now. What about the principle of free movement? What happens now to more than 1 million British people who live in other EU countries and almost 3 million EU citizens who live in the UK? Here too, David Cameron hoped to calm fears.
I would also reassure Brits living in European countries and European citizens living here that there will be no immediate changes in your circumstances. There will be no initial change in the way our people can travel, in the way our goods can move, or the way our services can be sold.
No immediate change then, but what of the future? Will British people now need visas to travel to France and beyond? The truth is that no one yet knows. The process ahead is unprecedented. EU leaders had all wanted the UK to stay in. So too did the US. But the marriage papers have been ripped apart, and Britain will now need to form new relationships. We're in uncharted territory here. Caroline Hawley, BBC News.
The time is just after 1:20 our top story this lunchtime. A huge moment of history as the UK votes to leave the European Union. The Prime Minister, David Cameron, says he will now stand down. After more than 4 decades in the EU, a decisive vote as more than 17 million people vote to leave.
In South today, celebrations for the Leave campaign. As people in the South vote decisively to exit the European Union. And uncertainty over hundreds of jobs as a Southampton cruise company plans a new headquarters in Germany.
Well, the vote was decisive. 52% choosing to leave, 48% wanting to remain in the European Union. Let's look now at a breakdown, a much more detailed breakdown of how the vote worked throughout the United Kingdom. Christian Fraser has been crunching the numbers.
Let's take a look at those numbers then in greater detail. We'll start with England, shall we? Over 28 million votes cast on Thursday. Turnout 73%. They did think a high turnout would be good for Remain. Well, that's the highest turnout since 1992 in a nationwide vote. The margin of victory, 6 points for Leave. The pollsters, the city, the bookies, they all got it wrong because they didn't understand what was going on in rural England and in these key Labour supporting areas in the north and northwest of the country. The maroon bits of yellow, Liverpool, Manchester, Leeds, York, Harrogate, more affluent areas of Yorkshire, of course, and Newcastle, but only by the slenderest of margins. London, as we said, almost wholly voting for Remain, but not all parts of the south. Some key areas in Kent there in blue. Let's have a look at Scotland. Very different picture, of course. All 32 authorities voting for Remain. 2.7 million people voted in Scotland, so the turnout lower than the UK average. Voter fatigue? Possibly. They've had 4 elections in Scotland in under 2 years. But you can see the result is overwhelming. 62% for Remain against 38%. Edinburgh, 74% in favour of Remain. And that is what is opening up this debate again about a Scotland independence vote. Similar story and picture in Northern Ireland. 790,000 people voting in Northern Ireland. Turnout slightly lower than the UK average. But look at this, all the yellow areas around the border regions. 3 out of 4 areas in Belfast voting for Remain. In Wales, big turnout, but only 5 of the 22 areas voting for Remain. Cardiff, yes. Swansea, no. Areas like Merthyr Tydfil, Newport, Caerphilly, big Labour areas all going for Leave. In fact, let me show you the key Leave supporting areas in the country. 2 of them in Lincolnshire at the top of the pile. So here you go, Boston, South Holland in Lincolnshire, Castle Point in Essex, Thurrock and Great Yarmouth, big UKIP supporting areas. Top 5 remaining, no surprise, Gibraltar there at the top, almost overwhelmingly in favour of Remain. Lambeth, Hackney and Haringey, the London boroughs, foil there in Northern Ireland. Remember, you can check all the results on our website, bbc.co.uk/news.
Christian, thank you. Well, voters in England chose to leave the EU, with 9 regions seeing more than 70% opting to go. Only London voted to remain. Dan Johnson has been to Worcester to find out what swayed the vote there.
On a clear, bright morning, Worcester picked itself up and dusted itself down after a bruising campaign that leaves the country feeling its way along a new path.
What are you hoping will change now?
Everything. Working conditions, housing.
I think it's a good thing. What sort of message do you think it sends? That we can't be bullied. That we're fed up of being messed about by Brussels.
It is scary, but I think it's excitingly scary. But I think we'll pull through. We're British.
I personally think it's going to be a bad thing for England in a few years. I think it'll put us back into a recession.
This city was thought to be split right down the middle, 50-50 Leave and Remain. In the event, the Leave vote won here by 54%. And it's not hard to find people who are pleased with the result.
The greengrocer's one of them.
I think the common person just thinks about the immigration side of things more than anything.
And the window cleaner's happy.
Everybody I spoke to seemed to be saying leave. I think there was a handful of people that said stay in, so yeah, I think it's an honest vote as well.
The butcher, not so much.
Are you worried about what happens next?
I think I am, yeah. I think I am. I think people the last few months have really been holding on to their money because they don't know which way it's going to go.
And for residents of the St John's Tower blocks, one thing has dominated this vote.
Our own people can't get jobs. And I don't like people coming into this country undercutting our people.
I think people just stuck 2 fingers up to the establishment. That's what it amounts to, really. People who didn't think they were being listened to.
What do you think has made people vote that way?
Immigration.
Immigration.
People here have said what they want. There you go. Now, they wait to see how it's delivered. Dan Johnson, BBC News, Worcester.
In Northern Ireland, which voted to remain, the Deputy First Minister, Sinn Féin's Martin McGuinness, said the Brexit vote was a disaster and that there is now a democratic imperative for a referendum on Irish unity. Our Ireland correspondent Chris Buckler reports.
Today's result means inevitable change for Northern Ireland, and what happens next is deeply important to rebuilding the economy here. Trading with other European countries doesn't just mean crossing oceans. Here it also means driving along currently open roads. This is the border with the Republic of Ireland. Not that you can see it. But many have suggested that this vote to leave could mean a return of customs checkpoints on what will become a frontier with the EU.